Have you seen an instruction manual for an F40 LM? It's basically a little paper booklet that looks like it's been drawn by a 10-year-old child.
Welcome back to part 2 of our interview with Chris Palmer. In part 1, Chris told us about his ownership experience with the legendary McLaren F1 road car to the F1 GTR that raced at Le Mans. This time, we're going to be hearing about Chris's experiences with 3 of Ferrari's Big 5.
Yeah, I was offered a chap I knew, Peter Cook, who bought in the late 80s, was it late 80s, maybe 90, he bought my first F40 road car. And very sadly, he finished up, I think he crashed it. Rather than use it on the road, he converted it into a race car. And he had an accident in it. I think it was either, it might have been Castle Coombe or Thruxton, but he hit it went off the track anyway, basically, and hit a dirt mound, and the car burst into flames. So that was the demise of one of the F40s. So yeah, but after that, I was obviously, Peter carried on racing. I think he raced a Viper at the time, a Dodge Viper. And I met him somewhere, one of the race circuits, and he said, "Oh, I've got a chance to buy this LM, an F40 LM, one of the genuine, they're only very rare, much rarer than the GTRs, really." Well, yeah, I think there were 19 of them, 19 genuine LMs. And this car had come from the Matsuda collection in Japan. And he wasn't particularly doing anything with it. He couldn't race it at that time when he had it. But I did say to him, I said, "If ever you want to sell it, would you give me first chance on it?" And true to his word, he did. So I finished up with that. It had got, from memory, 5 boost settings. And the minimum boost on it, like I said, I think the minimum boost on it was 600, which was basically wet weather setting. But qualifying was all the way around to number 1. That was 780 horsepower in a car that weighed 1,050 kilos. And had got, I mean, if you look at one side by side with an F40, it's so much more than an F40 with spoilers. It's wider, it's a totally different car. But it's a hell of a thing to drive. It's just, oh, what an adrenaline rush. The clutch is obviously very heavy. So it's like most race cars. You've got to make sure that everything's warmed through, and if ever there was a car like this, you used to say with the old Ferraris, when they're called first, third, fifth, you forget second, forget fourth. The F40 LM is more so. Definitely forget second and fourth until the gearbox is warmed up. But other than that, yeah, just obviously put the power on, master switch, put the power on, press the squidgy button, fire it up. But even on tick over, I mean, it's got 3-inch pipes on it, 3 gooseneck pipes coming out the back. It sounds immense. They say normally turbo cars, you don't get a good sound from them. You get a fantastic sound from an F40 LM that's in that state of tune. It's just, the word is immense. It's like nothing you've ever driven. They're both fantastic in their own way. Obviously the V2, I mean, one of the things about the F1 GTR, obviously the induction noise, even on the road car, if you've been fortunate enough to be in an F1 road car, the induction noise dominates, and it's such a noise, it's like, but obviously that engine, Paul Rocher engine, is fantastic, and without the exhaust silencers on it, over and above, you can imagine it's, well, you've heard them at Le Mans, the F1 GTRs are just epic. But in its own way, the F40 LM is equal to it, but it's just a different noise. But it's difficult to say which one is the best. The car was becoming, obviously, and around this time, sadly, people were starting to put noise limits on various circuits. So you had to pick and choose really where you could take the car. But I do distinctly remember, sadly, we had an invite down to sort of Donington, which is, as you know, it's our sort of local circuit. I know it reasonably well. Driven a few things around there, and they asked me to go down and the Ferrari Owners Club. So I took down the standard car. At the time I'd got a standard F40 and the F40 LM, so I took them both down in a truck, and they asked me to do some demo laps at lunchtime in the F40 LM. So yeah, lunchtime came, closed the circuit, blah blah blah. To say it was a disaster is an understatement. The track officials black flagged me after 3 laps just for the noise issue. So I was a bit miffed about it. Like, I'd gone to the trouble, an invitation like, will you fetch the car down? Which we did. You know, 2 or 3 guys to get it ready, get it loaded, unloaded, etc., transport, what have you, for 2 or 3 laps, and then black flagged. Sorry, no, we can't have that. Thanks, but no thanks. It's too loud. Have you seen an instruction manual for an F40 LM? It's basically a little paper booklet that looks like it's been drawn by a 10-year-old child. And there are a few sort of hand diagrams, and then half of it's written in pidgin English, half of it's written in broken Italian, and you just think, what is this? Yeah, so, you know, you have to sort of figure out how to start the car. It runs on 100 and I think it was 102 octane. It runs best on that, so it's running on it's running on rocket fuel. But yeah, what an amazing car! What an amazing car! The GTEs, the GTEs, obviously the LMs, a lot of the LMs went sort of like into collections as mine did, or came from the Matsuda collection. And they were actually all built at the time, I think, by Michelotto. They weren't built by Ferrari. So they're a sort of, not, I wouldn't call it a halfway house, but there were quite a few people, I think, in the Italian Championship or the various European Championships used to sort of modify a standard F40. So they'd get more power out of it, they'd send it back to Michelotto for some racing parts, slightly bigger rims, bigger brakes, maybe a different engine management system, different exhaust system, stiffen it up, and they'd race it in, you know, in the various marque championships around Europe. So the GTEs were not, they were more than a standard F40, but not quite an LM. F40 GTE. I managed to buy that. I think that number came from off the DVLA for not a lot of money. No use to anybody unless you happen to have an F40. I think from memory it was putting out about 580 horsepower, 560, 580 horsepower. But the engine was very, very easily good enough for that. Put a different exhaust on it, get rid of the back pressure. Reasonably tractable. Fitted it with a different rear wing, put a gurney on the rear wing, a bigger rear wing with a gurney, put dive plates on it, changed the pads. So yeah, that was like an F40 plus 10%. I have had an F50, which you're not going to believe this. To my huge embarrassment, I didn't particularly want the car at the time. And the guy that bought the F1 GTR wanted me to take the F50 in part exchange, which I did, and then promptly sold it 3 months later. So I can't really give you any opinion on F50s other than now the car seems to have come into its own. You know, it was the ugly duckling, people didn't like it, and now I think it's taken 20 years, but opinions have changed on the car. And as I think you're aware, a very, very good friend of mine has got one, and he's owned that car for, I don't know, 23 years, I think 24 years he's had it, if my maths is right, and he absolutely loves it, you know, and he stuck with it when people were, oh, you know, the F40 is a better car, whatever. The Enzo was the latest, hottest thing from Ferrari. I really loved the look of it. It hadn't got sort of any, you know, huge spoilers on it. It looked relatively clean, and it was a very unusual design. You couldn't, at the time, you couldn't get them pretty much for love nor money in this country. But a chap who we were doing business with, who at the time had a company that sold footwear, training shoes. And we used to deal with a company down in Monaco, and we went down there, and as it happened, Puma were sponsoring Ferrari at the time. And the two directors of the company that we dealt with, who were sponsoring, that was their head office, based in Monaco, they had an Enzo apiece coming. So we very quickly managed to do a deal on an Enzo. He never drove it, so I was really its first owner as such. And so we got the car shipped over to England, and that's how that one came about. From memory, I possibly had that car for 3 or 4 years. The usual trips, trips up to Scotland in it, or obviously went to most of the circuits in it. And I really like the car even to this day. I think it's such an unusual looking car. To me, I would still take an Enzo over a LaFerrari. I think it's a more unusual car. The only sort of downside I would say to an Enzo is perhaps a gearbox, which at the time it was pretty much first generation, paddles. So I suppose it was the way to go, but obviously the gearboxes have come on, so much quicker gear changes, etc. But that would be my only criticism of it, but I'm nitpicking, to be honest. In its day it was a great car. Most memorable trip in it, I suppose, was to Le Mans. We did go to Le Mans in that. There is a video maybe somewhere that some of the lads took, demonstrating an Enzo destroying Diablos. And I mean, it ran away from them, as you can imagine it would. 217 miles an hour, apparently they do.